My name is Marin Doval. I turned 71 last spring, though the number feels both too high for how steady my hands remain and too low for how heavy my heart sometimes gets. I live alone in a small cedar house on a bluff just outside Astoria, Oregon, where the wind from the Columbia River keeps the curtains breathing even when the windows are closed. Most mornings follow a rhythm grind the beans set, the oven feed the stray tabby that pretends not to need me. That Thanksgiving morning began no differently. The pie crusts cooled on the counter golden and crisp. I had been waiting for Clarissa's usual message, something like, "Bring your stuffing, Mom. Don't forget the rosemary." My phone buzzed beside the rolling pin, and I smiled before I looked. The words hit first, sharp and absurd. "You're banned from Thanksgiving, idiot." For a moment, I thought it was a joke, the kind she used to make as a teenager when sarcasm was her language of love. But then came the photo, Clarissa, her husband Grayson, and his 2 grown sons around a glowing table, silverware, mid-air, laughter, frozen in the flash. The caption read, "Family only this year." I stared long enough for the oven timer to finish beeping and fall silent. The smell of overbaked apples crept up behind me, but I didn't move. I just held the phone, feeling the pulse beneath my thumb steady itself into something cold. I typed one word, "Okay," and pressed send. No exclamation point, no question mark, nothing to invite conversation. Then I turned off the oven, slid the pie into the sink, and let the water hiss over it. The house was quiet, except for the clock over the pantry door. I wiped my hands on the towel and set my phone face down on the table. The screen dimmed, taking their laughter with it. I whispered, "Noted to no one in particular," and deleted the thread. Outside, the tide was coming in, the kind that swells against the rocks and pulls everything loose back into itself. I opened the back door to the wind and let the salt air roll through the kitchen, washing out the sweetness. Then I sat down, folded my hands, and decided for the first time in years to do absolutely nothing. The silence held. I didn't check my phone again that day. The house stayed quiet except for the hum of the fridge and the slow tick of the pantry clock. I washed the counters, folded the towel, and let my thoughts drift toward the past, the years when helping felt like love. Clarissa had been 20 when she called crying about rent. Owen was still alive, then still strong enough to believe in second chances. We wired her the money the same afternoon, both of us eager to keep her safe. Later, when her car broke down, I co-signed the loan without hesitation. "It's only a signature," she'd said. I told myself the same thing when we helped again and again and again. After Owen died, everything shifted. Clarissa's calls turned from worried to expectant. She married Grayson, a man with an easy smile and hands that never seemed to stay in honest work. His sons, Kyle and Brandon, called me Miss Marin at first, then Grandma when it suited them. They arrived for dinners, borrowed my tools left with gas money. I remember one spring afternoon when Clarissa asked me to cover Brandon's tuition for a certification program. "It's an investment," she'd said, her tone sharp enough to cut through my hesitation. I wrote the check anyway. Months later, when he quit, she blamed me for encouraging him too much. That pattern became our rhythm. Every favor grew teeth. Every kindness turned into evidence that I was controlling, manipulative, obsessed with being needed. The words from her last spring phone call still ring clear. "You make everything about control, Mom. You can't just help, you have to own." I remember standing by the window that day, holding the receiver as if it might turn warm again. I didn't argue. I only listened until she ran out of air. Now the kitchen smelled faintly of damp apples and dish soap. Outside, the tide pressed against the rocks with a patient, endless rhythm. I realized then that my silence wasn't new. It had been forming for years, shaped by every favor I'd given and every apology I'd swallowed. That night, I locked the door, turned off the lights, and let the quiet keep me company. The morning after Thanksgiving, the rain came sideways across the bluff. It tapped against the window panes in uneven rhythms like someone asking permission to enter. I made coffee and sat at the table with my old leather binder, the one Owen and I had used for bills when he was alive. The cover was faded, the edges soft from years of opening and closing. Inside the tabs were still labeled in my handwriting, neat as ledger lines. Mortgage, insurance, utilities accounts. Tucked near the back was a folder I hadn't touched in years. Clarissa Accounts. The title looked harmless, handwritten in blue ink, but as I flipped it open, I felt the quiet sting of memory. Bank statements. Password printouts. A list of automatic payments I had set up long ago to make things easier after her second move. Power, gas, mortgage, all linked through my credentials. She had promised to learn how to manage them herself. She never did, and I never forced the lesson. I found a notepad beside the binder and wrote 3 words at the top. End the overlap, then underlined them twice. The first call went to the bank. I explained slowly and clearly that I wanted to remove my name from every shared authorization. The woman on the line was polite, her voice measured as if she had done this for mothers like me before. She confirmed the forms would arrive by mail, and that once signed, I would no longer have any financial ties to Clarissa's household. When I hung up, the kitchen felt lighter. Next, I scrolled through my contacts until I found Benedict Cole. Benedict and I had worked together when I still handled estate accounts. He was half retired now, a widower, with a voice like warm gravel. I left a short message asking if we could meet that week to review a few documents. By the time I closed the binder, the rain had thinned to mist. I rinsed my cup and set it on the rack, careful not to make a sound. Something in me had settled, not anger, not relief, just order returning to its rightful place. For the first time in years, I felt the balance sheet of my life beginning to clear. Benedict's office sat above an old bookstore on Marine Drive, the kind of place that always smelled faintly of salt and paper. I arrived with my binder tucked under one arm and a steady calm that felt almost foreign. He met me at the door with his familiar half-smile, his glasses slipping low on his nose. "Marin Doval," he said, motioning me inside. Still carrying more order in one folder than most people keep in their entire lives. I smiled, setting the binder on his desk. Old habits. They've kept me afloat. We spent the morning reviewing everything. Bank accounts, utilities, the co-signed mortgage from years ago. Benedict flipped through each document carefully, making quiet notes in the margins. His office was lined with framed maps of the Oregon coast, each one marked with tidy pins where storms had once hit. "You're still legally tied to 3 of these," he said, finally tapping his pen against the papers. "Utilities, the small business credit card, and the home insurance policy. You can withdraw without penalty, but it needs to be in writing, certified mail." He began dictating letters, slow and deliberate, while I typed. "Terminate cosigner status, effective immediately. Request closure of redundant joint accounts. Transfer billing responsibility solely to Clarissa Doval Fraser." Each line felt cleaner than the last, like dust being swept from a long-sealed room. When we finished, he leaned back, folding his hands over the binder. "They'll feel the absence like loss," he said quietly. "That's the point," I replied, surprised by how steady my voice sounded. He smiled, not approval exactly, but understanding. Before I left, he handed me a stamped envelope for the bank and another for the insurance company. "Once you send these," he said, "you're officially free." Outside, the air smelled of river and rain. I walked down to the pier before heading home. The tide was low, the pilings slick and dark beneath the waterline. I stood there until the wind picked up cold and clean, pulling the last of the salt into my lungs. When I finally turned back toward my car, my hands were empty, and the weight I'd carried for years felt lighter by half. The next week passed in quiet concentration. I spent my mornings at the kitchen table binder, open the sound of rain tracing the roof above me. Each column of numbers and dates had its own pulse, familiar and precise. I followed it carefully, line by line, the way I used to when reconciling clients' ledgers years ago. The first task was the utilities. I checked every autopay schedule, noting the due dates that would land just after Thanksgiving. Electric, gas, and water would all renew under Clarissa's name by default once my authorization ended. I sent confirmations to each company, forwarding receipts to her current email address on record. My name was removed from every field that once carried it, replaced with hers. Next came the mortgage assistance account I had created after her second job loss. I closed it formally, transferring the remaining balance to my savings. The note in the margin read, "Legal release complete." By mid-afternoon, the table was covered with envelopes, each labeled in my clean accountant's script. I sorted them by category: bank, insurance, utilities, credit, and stacked them neatly in order of mailing. No deceit, no intrusion, only correction. Dependence had turned into habit long ago. Now I was simply ending the pattern. Before sunset, I updated my own records. Every folder was scanned, renamed, and stored in the cloud under a single heading: Marin DeVell Independent Accounts. When I finished, I flipped to the last page of my ledger and wrote a single line in careful ink: all clear, boundaries intact. I closed the binder, pressed my hand against its worn cover, and exhaled slowly. The numbers had always given me comfort because they never lied. They reflected what was true even when emotions tried to blur it. That evening, I lit a candle on the windowsill. Its flame wavered in the breeze. From the slightly open pane, a small but steady light. I sat beside it with a cup of tea, listening to the faint hum of the refrigerator, the only thing left running on my account. The house felt balanced again, quiet, ordered, and entirely mine. 2 days after Thanksgiving, I woke to the sound of wind scraping along the windows. The air smelled of salt and wet pine. The candle I had burned the night before had melted into a shallow pool of wax, hardening in the chill. I poured coffee and sat by the table, watching the gulls circle low over the river fog. The phone buzzed once, then again, then endlessly. I turned it over face down. A few minutes later, curiosity won. I flipped it and read, "Mom, internet's down. Did you pay the bill wrong?" Another followed. "The gas company says the account changed. What did you do?" Then, "Mortgage company's calling. They say you were removed. What's going on?" Each message came faster, building like a rainstorm. I let them pile up unread after the first few. Outside, the tide pressed hard against the rocks, gray and swollen from the weather. By afternoon, the local news showed reports of power outages across the coast. The anchors spoke about flooded streets and flickering grids. It felt appropriate somehow, nature mirroring what had begun to unravel elsewhere. When the house phone rang, I recognized Clarissa's number by heart. I let it go to voicemail. Her voice cracked through the speaker, sharp and trembling. "You did this, didn't you? Don't play innocent. Everything's falling apart. Bills, accounts, everything. I can't even log in." I listened until the line went silent, then replayed it once more before deleting it. I made tea chamomile this time and sat by the window again. The light outside shifted into that soft blue that comes before night. Somewhere down the hill, a generator kicked on, humming faintly through the mist. The house around me stayed steady. The clock ticked. The tea cooled. And though a small part of me ached for the sound of her voice before it turned bitter, I did not reach for the phone again. Some lessons needed space to echo. Some kinds of peace required distance to sound like peace at all. The storm lasted 3 days. The sky stayed the color of metal, the streets in town slick with branches and mud. By the time the wind quieted, my voicemail was full, and my phone listed 87 missed calls. I scrolled through them once slowly, then set it face down again. By the end of the week, news drifted through the small-town grapevine. Kyle's car had been repossessed. Brandon's investment project had dissolved after he failed to meet payments. Grayson had gone on business, which in his language usually meant disappearing until someone else solved the mess. Clarissa's name came up more than once at the market whispers about late notices, bounced checks, and arguments loud enough for the neighbors to hear. That Saturday evening, rain returned in a thin, cold mist. I was folding laundry when headlights swept across my living room wall. A moment later, pounding hit the front door. I didn't hurry. When I opened it, Clarissa stood there soaked through hair clinging to her face, eyes red and wild. "You ruined us," she said. Her voice was raw, thin from shouting before she ever reached my porch. "You cut everything off, utilities, insurance, mortgage, all of it. You think you can just do that?" I looked at her coat dripping onto the mat and the tremor in her hands. "I didn't ruin you," I said quietly. "I just stopped fixing you." For a second she froze, as if she hadn't heard right. Then her breath hitched. She started crying loud at first, then softer, until the sound was only wet air between us. She kept saying my name like a question she didn't know how to finish. I reached into the stand by the door and pulled out an old umbrella, navy blue with a broken rib. I pressed it into her hand. "You'll catch cold," I said. She stared at me, unsure whether to throw it back or hold it tighter. When she turned away, the porch light caught her reflection in the puddles, fractured and trembling. I watched until her car pulled from the drive, then shut the door and leaned against it, breathing evenly, as if balance had just been restored by the weight of silence itself. Weeks passed before the rain finally gave way to a steady, pale winter light. The town began to thaw in its quiet way, boats moving again on the river, the scent of cedar smoke floating through the neighborhood. I filled my days with small tasks, organizing old tax files, pruning the potted rosemary by the kitchen window, listening to the radio just loud enough to keep the silence from echoing. One afternoon, while driving into town, I took the long route past Clarissa's subdivision. Her street was lined with identical houses, each trimmed in the same shade of white, each pretending to be steady. Halfway down her yard stood out. The grass had gone wild around the fence, and a crooked for sale sign leaned toward the sidewalk, its letters faded from rain. Two women stood by the mailbox talking in low voices. I slowed just enough to hear fragments foreclosure bank notice husband gone. They looked up as I passed, but I kept my eyes forward. The house that used to hum with noise looked hollow, curtains drawn, porch light, dead. I parked at the lookout a few blocks away, where the road curved toward the water. The clouds above the river broke apart in streaks of gray and silver, the kind of light that flattens everything into honesty. I sat there for a while, hands resting on the steering wheel, until the cold began to creep in through the glass. Then I turned the car around and drove home by another street. That evening, my phone buzzed once on the counter. The message was short. "We're leaving Portland. Take care." No apology, no explanation, no name attached. Just that. I saved it not to read again, but to know it existed. The words stayed like a small, folded note inside me, unfinished, but final. When night fell, I stepped onto my porch. The wind smelled of rain and wood smoke. I pulled my cardigan closer, feeling the quiet spread through me. The house behind me was warm and steady, the only one I needed to keep lit. A full year passed before Thanksgiving came around again. The morning air carried the same cool bite as before, but it felt different, somehow less heavy, more honest. I woke early, not because anyone expected me to bring a dish, but because habit still held a rhythm of its own. The house smelled of sage and butter. I roasted a small chicken enough for two. The table was simple. One plate, one glass, one candle. The pie cooled on the counter, the crust golden and even this time. Outside, gulls drifted above the river, slow and unhurried, as if the whole town had agreed to move at a gentler pace. Before sitting down, I packed half the meal into a tin and wrapped it carefully in foil. My neighbor, Ivor Harland, had lost his wife that past spring. He lived 2 houses down, a quiet man who spent his days tending to the geraniums she used to love. I knocked lightly, and when he opened the door, his smile was tired, but kind. "I made too much again," I said. He chuckled. "You and everyone who's ever cooked for Thanksgiving." We ate together at his kitchen table, the conversation soft and meandering, how the river's current changed after winter storms, how we both slept lighter than we used to, how gratitude becomes simpler with age. He spoke of his late wife as though she'd just stepped into another room, and I listened, finding comfort in the ordinary shape of shared memory. When I left, the light outside had thinned into a gray shimmer over the water. I walked home slowly, carrying the empty tin against my chest. Inside my house, the candle still flickered on the table, steady and warm. I sat down again this time with no ache in the silence. I poured myself a small glass of wine and lifted it toward the candle flame. The house didn't feel lonely anymore. It simply felt lived-in, settled, and full of air that belonged to me. The following spring, the days stretched longer, and the air along the river carried that faint sweetness that comes just before bloom. I had the porch repainted pale gray, the same color Owen once said made the house look like morning. When the work was done, I called the local hardware shop to ask about a new light fixture. They sent a young man with kind eyes and steady hands. He held up a brass lantern, simple but solid. "It'll weather well," he said. I nodded and asked if he could have something engraved on the base plate. The next week, he came back with it finished. The words were small but clear, built by boundaries, kept by respect. He installed it just above the steps where the old fixture had flickered for years. When he left, I stayed on the porch, tracing the letters with my thumb, feeling the cool metal, warm slowly under the sun. That evening, I turned the switch. The new light flared once, then settled into a steady glow that washed over the railing and spilled softly onto the path below. Through the front window, I could see the reflection of a photograph on the wall, a younger version of me holding Clarissa on my lap, her hair a wild halo against my cheek. The picture had faded at the edges, the color soft as memory itself. I stood there for a while, listening to the low hum of the bulb. The house around me was still, the air calm. I touched the frame lightly and whispered, "We'll be okay, separately." Outside, the tide began to move in slow and even, carrying bits of driftwood and light across the darkening water. The rhythm of it felt familiar, like a heartbeat remembered from far away. Before I went inside, I looked once more at the porch light. It wasn't just a lamp, it was a marker, a quiet promise to myself that peace can last when it's protected. Then I closed the door gently, leaving the glow to keep its watch over the night.